Welcome to those of you online and those of you in the audience for the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution Literature and Humanities Group. And tonight we're approaching the French territory, so I would appreciate it if you'd overlook my accent if I have to pronounce any of these words. Thank you. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Sandra Daroczi. She's a lecturer in French studies at the University of Bath. She did her doctoral research at the University of Exeter, analyzing the reception of fictional works by contemporary French women writers. She guest co-edited a special issue of L'Esprit Créateur and has published an article on depictions found in Marie Daroczi's work in a special issue of the Journal of Romance Studies. Her contribution to edited collections includes chapters on Julia Kristeva and the French women's liberation movement. Her most recent article analyzes the manner in which contemporary French women writers write about the lives of women artists of the 19th and 20th centuries. She has also organized a series of workshops for local Bath museums, including the Holborns Up Late, focused on the presence and absence of women from museum spaces. She is currently working on a monograph examining aspects of Monique Wittig's fiction. Can we please welcome Sandra?
Thank you very much to the institution for having me, and thank you very much to Betty and to Steve for having thought of me for this talk. Do I need to lower it a bit? There we go. So hopefully that works. Excellent. So the main sort of aim of this talk is really to introduce you to a French woman writer that I love and admire, and who in the past few years has really known a resurgence in interest, and that author is Monique Wittig. Now, I will barely be scratching the surface of Monique Wittig's work, and I'm hoping that that just sort of offers a flavor, and then some of you might be interested in finding out more. And I will keep an eye on the time, but if I do go over, Betty, feel free to stop me at any point. So it's not always straightforward to choose a sort of a cutoff point in time for a talk that aims to offer really quite a broad overview of an author's work in a particular social cultural context. But maybe for contemporary France and for contemporary French society, May 68 seems to be quite a sort of obvious point of departure, though I must admit that I'm not sticking quite as strictly to the May 68 because I will go a bit in front before May 68 just for one novel. So we usually associate May 68 to, I need to click here, and now, there we go. We usually associate May 68 with the students and the workers' movement, and with the spark that then led to the emergence of the feminist, LGBTQI+, and even the green political movement in France. And yet, if we take the feminist movement as our starting point, we notice that actually women's issues were really much absent from May, June 68. And that is despite the active involvement of women, both at the Sorbonne Occupée and in the factories. So it's not that women weren't there. They were very much there, they were very much present, and they were very much really putting a lot of hard work in to what was May, June 1968. But actually what happened is that their issues weren't on the agenda. When they proposed to organize certain debates at the Sorbonne Occupée, there were very few debates that were sort of accepted because they didn't have a theory. And actually a lot of the labor union leaders were women, then said after the negotiations in the Rue Grenelle that they regretted not having been at the negotiating table. And that's really much what Christine Ross observes in this quotation. Women activists in the Comité d'Action, in the streets or in the factories, tend to self-identify as a number of things: workers, members of different groupuscules, political tendencies, German Jews, as the pègres or the riffraff, as activists or citizens, rather than as women per se. In the repertory of approximately 350 posters that were produced by the Atelier Populaire de Beaux-Arts during May and June, only one bears a representation of a female figure, and it is Marianne, the Republic. So it's quite to be expected. And that's partly whilst they weren't necessarily identifying as women, they were also not given the space to identify as women and they weren't necessarily allowed to debate women's issues. It's not just an Anglo-Saxon, I'm just going to admit somebody, there we go. It's not just an Anglo-Saxon opinion that women were not present. It is confirmed by French researchers as well. So we've got this Histoire du Féminisme by Michèle Riot-Sarcey, and she sort of kind of observes the same thing. I do have translations for everything else, but I was just sort of trying to show that it is something that French researchers have noticed as well. So in this sense, May 1968 had both a positive impact and a negative impact on the women's movement. Positive in the sense that women realized that something can be done through social movement, through social protest, and especially through some of those creative means on protest that we see during May and June 1968. Negative because they weren't there, because their issues weren't represented, because they were marginalized. And arguably, we could say that it is that negative impact that then sparked what was to become the second wave of feminism in France, or what we now call largely the MLF, le Mouvement de Libération des Femmes, or the French Women's Liberation Movement. But there were also groups that weren't necessarily affiliated to the MLF. What women realized in this period is that if they wanted to go, that had to happen outside of sort of political parties on the left and outside of the labor union movement. Despite the fact that in the MLF, we then do have crossovers with political parties and with the labor union movement. Why was that? Because even in these political parties on the left and even in the labor movement, women were still sort of relegated to the margins, or they were relegated to certain feminine roles. So they were doing secretarial work, for example. Labor union leaders weren't shy to send women to use their charm to recruit workers in the factories, but they wouldn't invite them at the negotiating table to discuss issues that concerned women workers. So they were still very much active and working, but really they weren't sort of taken seriously or in the sort of higher echelons. Similarly, the sentence that we associate with second wave feminism, which is the personal is political, on the left and in the labor union movement, it was very much seen as too bourgeois, that the personal couldn't be political, so that the personal wasn't really taken into account in that kind of revolutionary political movement. So that's really where women were in and around 1968. And it is really that realization that fuels what is to become le Mouvement de Libération des Femmes and the second wave of feminism in France. It is important to note that women's groups did exist in France before 1968. So it's not that May 1968 happened and suddenly we have women's groups. They did exist before. But it was really that context and that realization of the absence and that sort of positive and negative impact on May 68 that kind of pushed what was to become in the early 70s, really that strong MLF movement. Now, one of the main challenges that women faced at the time was actually getting published and also getting all of these groups to be in touch. Now, you will see that a lot of the things that I mentioned are very Paris-centric, right? And we have a lot of information from the groups that were based in the capital. That doesn't mean that there weren't groups in the rest of France. It's just that it's harder to get information about them. And it was harder for them as well to be in touch with the Paris groups. But even groups in Paris amongst themselves didn't always know each other, and it was quite difficult for them to get in touch. The most obvious way to get in touch was through publications, to newspapers or journals or magazines that were fairly widely read. But what happens was that despite the fact that women were writing to these newspapers, they wouldn't get published in them. So then that kind of meant there was no communication, there was no way for them to get in touch. Now, one such exception is this article, Combat pour la libération de la femme, so fight for the liberation of the woman, and that appears in May 1970 in l'Idiot International. Now that is signed, as you can see, by Monique Wittig, Gilles Wittig, Marcia Rothenborg, and Margaret Stevenson. So Monique Wittig, we already have her name appearing, and I'm going to sort of try and put her in the context of the time. Monique Wittig and Gilles Wittig were sisters, so Gilles Wittig was Monique Wittig's older sister. Now, this article was signed by these four women, but actually they belonged to a group that used to meet in Gilles Wittig's apartment, and that group was bigger. and it included Antoinette Fouque and people and women around Antoinette Fouque. Now, those of you sort of who are familiar with the French context might know of the French publishing house called Des Femmes. That's still going strong and it's publishing a lot. It is now called Des Femmes Antoinette Fouque. And there were already sort of disagreements in the movement, even in the movement that wasn't yet the MLF. And some of these disagreements were around sort of the ideas that Antoinette Fouque had, and then later on in the 70s, some of the things and some of the decisions that she took really estranged a big part of the MLF from her. So if you've got time in the Q&A, I can tell you a bit more about that. But this is just to show that despite the fact that there was more women who sort of contributed to the article or initially had the idea of it, only 4 actually put their name on it. So it already hints that as early as 1970, before the sort of official presence of the MLF on the French stage, really there were conflicts and disagreements. And then after this article appears, we've got this wonderful meeting on the 21st of May, 1970 at the Université de Vincennes. So it was the idea that it was a sort of first kind of bigger public meeting of the women's movement, or what was to become the women's movement. Now, most of you are probably familiar with this. So this happens on the 26th of August, 1970, and it's meant to be a sort of a spectacular symbolic manifestation, but manifestation might be a sort of a big word for it, because there's really only 9 to 10 women that actually take part in it, but the symbolic value of it is huge. And for many, many decades, this was sort of considered as the symbolic start of the MLF. And we still, you know, when I teach it, I still sort of present it as a symbolic start, despite the fact that, as I said, there were groups that existed before 1968, so we can trace back to prior to May 68. So we have a group of 9 to 10 women that go, and this is in solidarity with the women's strike in the States, which was much more sort of, you know, again, there were more women involved in that one. So what they decided to do is they decided to go to the Arc de Triomphe, where there is the tomb of the unknown soldier. And they decided to go and put a wreath of flowers on the tomb, but not for the unknown soldier, but rather for somebody more unknown than the unknown soldier, and that is his wife. So that's what you see on one of the banners. Quelqu'un qui est plus inconnu encore que le soldat inconnu, sa femme. So somebody more unknown than the unknown soldier, his wife. And then this other banner, and this is the one that kind of really sparked a lot of interest and controversy, and lots of people didn't understand it. It says, un homme sur deux est une femme. So a man in 2 is a woman, but in French means both man and person or human being. But very often when it's used as to kind of cover everybody, it is still biased to sort of mean men, not women. So a lot of people didn't quite understand what do you mean a man in 2 is a woman, but just really showing that half of the population is women. It's just that they're not being taken into account. So this happens 26th of August, 1970. As I said, there's about 9, 10 of them. This sort of nice testimonial saying it's like there was just enough of us to carry the banners. They were quite heavy, so, you know, we had to sort of get in pairs to carry the banners, to carry the flowers. But what happens is, despite the fact that this is a small, arguably, you know, as many as we are here, it actually did have an impact in the newspapers. And that's really when we see the MLF kind of appearing in newspapers. So as you see, un groupe d'une dizaine de militantes, about 10 militantes. Now there is a mistake here. This is how it got published. But at that point, the newspaper called it Mouvement de libération de la femme française. So the movement of the liberation of the French woman, just the one woman, because all women are the same, and the French woman. Now, we don't have in the MLF, it's not called le Mouvement de Libération des Femmes Françaises, it's just called le Mouvement de Libération des Femmes, so women's liberation movement in the plural. But it does go to show that it wasn't yet, the movement wasn't yet known, and people just sort of assumed and wrote things down. And again, you've got this slogan, un homme sur deux est une femme. Now, the important thing was that some of the women who were part of this manifestation were not very well known, but some were. And 2 of them were really well known, and they are actually quoted in this article, Christiane Rochefort, so another author, and Monique Wittig. And at this point in 1970, Monique Wittig is quite well known on the French scene, and I'll tell you why. But I just wanted to sort of put her in context a bit, or in the socio-political context. Now, this is quite a fun Literama. This comes much later. So this is published in Village Voice in October 1988, and it's part of the literary supplement of the Village Voice. Now, anybody who works on post-structuralism or deconstructivism, this is quite a fun Literama to look at, because everybody here who sort of, you know, with their sort of hammers or pickers or whatever they are, they're the deconstructivists. You've got Sartre and Beauvoir here in Cotton Candy Corner. You've got Roland Barthes here, and unfortunately, you've got the laundry truck that actually hits him, and that kind of leads to his death. So there's a lot of sort of, you know, all sorts of people, Foucault, Lacan, Freud, so they're all kind of on this Literama. But what is important to look at is, for us, for today's talk, is the tunnel d'amour, so the love tunnel. We're going to question that as well. But who do we see coming out of the love tunnel, and who's leading the charge is Wittig, dressed as a warrior, and it's not random why she's dressed as a warrior. We'll see in a second why. And she's followed by Hélène Cixous, Julia Kristeva, and Lucie Rigaret. Now, I'm not sure how the four of them would feel to know that they're coming out of the tunnel d'amour. I'm not particularly of the sort of the love tunnel, but I guess it is a hint at, you know, sort of French feminism. And if you sort of pick up a book that might be called French feminism or something to do with French feminism, you'll probably see the name of these four women: Wittig, Cixous, Irigaray, and Kristeva. Now, actually, this idea of French feminism, it's very much an Anglo-American invention. French researchers, French scholars, French activists don't refer to it as French feminism. So it's something that we've invented as a kind of a label or something to help us make sense. But it's very much French feminisms in the plural. And I think somebody like Kristeva, for example, might not necessarily identify with the feminist movement, or might not say that she belongs to the feminist movement. And actually the four women here, so Wittig, Kristeva, Cixous, and Irigaray, are very different. We can't put them in French feminism in the singular, right? So that's why I said that it's very much sort of an Anglo-American invention. If anything, Wittig, for example, was against psychoanalysis, and she was very critical of the psychoanalytic sort of theories. And, you know, each of them, Cixous, Kristeva, Irigaray, they have brought immense contributions to gender theories, to learning about language, about women's writing, écriture féminine with Cixous, but they are very different amongst themselves as well. So we can't really put them in there in French feminism together. But it is important for us, for the purposes of this talk, to notice that Wittig is leading that charge, and that she makes it. This is 1988, this sort of, when the last novel she publishes in 1985. So it is important to know that in 1988, she's still considered significant and of great importance to be put on a Literama of sort of French culture and literature. Now, this one is just sort of, because I very much enjoyed going to Paris, but it just sort of goes to show where we are with Wittig now. And I'd like to thank my friend and colleague, Dr. Milena Romano, for taking that picture, because I do really like that picture. It means a lot to me. So, and I wouldn't have it without her. So this is 2 years ago, more or less at this time, 17th of September 2021, in the 14th arrondissement of Paris. And this is the official Jardin Monique Wittig. So it is now a public garden that can be visited. It's free to visit. And it was sort of opened 2 years ago, and I had the good fortune to be able to be there. And as you can see on the plaque, it says Jardin Monique Wittig, 1935-2003, écrivaine, so writer, but it is agreed in the feminine. So it's écrivaine with an E at the end. Militante lesbienne féministe. Now, with anybody that I spoke to during the opening, they were incredibly touched, and they thought it was of huge importance, the fact that it says militante lesbienne. The fact that in the French public space, somebody who was a lesbian activist is able to lay claim onto the French public space. That actually lesbianism and lesbian materialism or militantism and activism aren't hidden, that they aren't marginalized or peripheral, and actually that they can lay claim to the public space, which means they can lay claim to language, to a speaking position. So it was of huge, huge importance. We might look upon it and say, well, you know, it's great, but can it be of such huge importance? But we don't see it on every plaque in France. We might see écrivaine, we might see féministe, but we wouldn't see militante lesbienne, or not until very recently. So it's a huge importance. And the LGBTQI plus community who was present at the inauguration was really, really proud of this moment. So it really is an important sort of moment in contemporary politics. And we kind of get to 2023, and that's kind of where this talk fits in, because 2023 has been sort of named l'année Wittig, so the Wittig year. The reason for that is because, unfortunately, Wittig passed away 20 years ago. She passed away in 2003 in January. We're also celebrating 50 years from the publication of Le Corps Lesbien. So I've got props with me. There we are. So it's that one. So the Lesbian Body was published in France in 1973. And actually, there's huge events that have happened, and there's an array of events that have happened from January 2023 until the end of this year. And they're not just academic. They are also academic. There are conferences in the States, in Geneva, but they're also non-academic, lots of reading groups, lots of walks, lots of theatre representations. So it really is a way of sort of opening up and showing what Wittig can offer and what her work has to offer, not just to people who study her, but also to the younger generations. And I was pleasantly surprised to see at these events lots of people the age of my students, for example, so sort of in their late teens, early 20s, and a lot of the activities were actually put on by student groups. So it's really, really encouraging to see. Now, we also have a sort of a resurgence in interest via the publications. So this is the website of Édition de Minuit, and I'm going to come back to the importance of Édition de Minuit in a second, but you will see that they have re-edited some of the works, almost all of them. So the first one, Le Poponax, was re-edited in 2018. Les Guerrières was re-edited in 2019 or republished. Le Corps Lesbien was republished this year in 2023. So really to mark that kind of 50-year anniversary. Now, Le Voyage sans fin, which is here at the bottom, it's a play. This was republished last year with a different publishing house, Gallimard, so it's now part of the collection L'Imaginaire. But initially, when it was initially published in 1985, it was published as a supplement to the feminist magazine Vlasta. So it's quite hard to get your hand on a copy of Le Voyage sans fin, whereas now is much more available. Similarly, her collection of short stories, Paris la Politique, was published in 1999 with a different editor, POL, and they are also republishing it this year. So in September 2023, we've got a republishing of the short stories. So we see, you know, it's not just academic interest or non-academic interest or activist interest, but actually there's a lot of literary interest in Wittig as well. And we've got another re-editing, L'écriture de Monique Wittig, à la couleur de sa peau. So this is a book written by Catherine Carnot. It's an academic study of Wittig's work. And Catherine Carnot was the first person to write a doctoral thesis in French dedicated entirely to Wittig. So if doctoral theses might have been written about Wittig in English before, they might have sort of been, or Wittig might have been referenced in doctoral work before, Catherine Carnot was the first person in France to write a thesis entirely dedicated to Wittig. And that got re-edited. So that book got re-edited this year in 2023. And last year, Émilie Noteris wrote a biography of Monique Wittig. So you see that there's a lot of appetite for publication, for activities. And this was all picked up not long ago. At the end of July, there's a series of 5 podcasts on France Culture. So Avoir raison avec Monique Wittig. So there's 5 episodes dedicated exclusively to Monique Wittig. And they've already had another podcast a couple of years ago also about Monique Wittig. So any of you who like listening to podcasts in French, I really highly recommend it because they are really, really good fun. And a lot of the people that I've spoken to or that I quote in this talk are actually part of the podcast. And a lot of the people who've shared materials that have made it into the presentation. So I'll take this opportunity to thank them. So this just goes to show that there is, you know, if when I started working on Wittig just over 10 years ago, if I told somebody even from the French sort of, you know, scene, you know, I'm working on Monique Wittig, they might have asked, well, who is she? What has she done? Whereas now, I don't think that I would get that question that often because of this resurgence, but also because there's a resurgence via the younger generation. So, for example, you know, you've seen the hashtags, #Wittig 2023. There's a huge a lot of movement on Instagram, on Twitter. So there really is a resurgence of interest in her work. And this could be in her philosophical work, in her activist work, or in her fictional work. And that's really where I come in because my interest lies in the fictional work. Now, I just wanted to go back a bit to Les Éditions de Minuit. So those of you who are familiar with French literature will know that Les Éditions de Minuit are really a status symbol in France. They're one of the most highly respected publishing houses in France. They come with this sort of well-known cover. So as I said, I brought props with me. And this is kind of, if you see this in a library, you'll know that it's Édition de Minuit. It always comes with this sort of simple white cover, dark blue, navy blue, and you kind of have the symbol of the publishing house. So they're really recognizable. And a lot of the very well-regarded publishing houses in France have this sort of, quite simple but highly recognizable cover. Now, the other person that's associated with Les Éditions de Minuit was its editor, Jérôme Landon. So you have him here with Samuel Beckett in a picture. And it just, again, just to kind of reassert or underline really that the Éditions de Minuit and the work that Jérôme Landon did was really well known for the quality of the books that they were publishing, but also for the literary innovation. So more or less at the same time that Wittig was publishing, we have the phenomenon of the nouveau roman, or the new novel, and that is really sort of spearheaded by writers who are writing with Éditions de Minuit, so Claude Simon, Alain Robbe-Grillet, etc. So you get this sort of this appetite and this sort of high quality status that comes with Éditions de Minuit, but also literary innovation. To give you an idea of how well regarded Jérôme Landon was, so this is from a review of Le Corps Lesbien, but really the author of the review sort of saw Wittig as a thoroughbred of the Landon stable. So really the Landon stable, was just sort of the group of authors that were publishing with Éditions de Minuit. To give you an even better idea, if literature unfurls in waves, Jérôme Landon plays the part of the moon. He orders the tides. So really hugely influential on the French literary scene, and still very much is. The publishing house is now led by his daughter, but it still very much represents the same sort of quality and status. Now, through the years, the relationship between Monique Wittig and Jérôme Landon does cool off, and it cools off to a point where she then breaks away from Éditions de Minuit, and then later on, there are letters in the archive that kind of attest to maybe a sort of a rewarming of the relationship, or sort of an acknowledgement on Monique Wittig's part of the huge influence that Landon was in her life and in her sort of literary career. But as we go through the novel, so as we get through to the last one that I'll talk about today, by that point, the relationship with Jérôme Landon is really has cooled off. And there are sort of letters, correspondence in the archives that kind of attest to this cooling off. And reading them is quite emotional, and there is sort of quite heartbreaking to sort of see how a relationship sort of, gets to that point. But on a slightly more optimistic note, so I'll start with a couple of sort of biographical details. So she was born on the 13th of July, 1935 in Alsace. And in the 1950s, she comes to Paris to do her studies. She works as a teacher, but she also works in publishing and sort of some form of editorial assistant. And she is known to have worked with Jérôme Landon at Éditions de Minuit in the early 60s. Because there is the Dictionnaire de rue historique de Paris, so the Dictionary of Historical Streets in Paris, that was published in 1963. If any of you have it at home, if you look at the back of it, you will see Monique Wittig's name. So she had contributed in some form, either as an editorial assistant or a research assistant or something on those lines. So she is involved with Minuit early on, but not initially as a writer. What happens is that she writes her first novel, which is not actually one that I'm going to talk about, because her first novel is not published. So her first novel is called La Mécanique, and it is available in the archives. And I read it once a year ago when I went to see the archives. So I haven't yet kind of revisited it and reworked on it. So I can give you a bit of sort of a very brief plot of what happens, but just to really give you a taste. She shows La Mécanique to Jérôme Landon, and Jérôme Landon says, if you're going to send it to somebody else, I will publish it. Otherwise, I would advise you that you sort of keep honing your writing. So he was willing to publish it had she taken the manuscript to somebody else, but actually she doesn't publish La Mécanique, and she keeps honing her writing and she works on something else. Now, La Mécanique, as I said, I read it a year ago in the archives, so I had to sort of read it very quickly in about a day, but it is very different from what we're used to from Monique Wittig. First of all, there is there's more of a plot than there is in the other ones. So it is a plot that I can actually sum up. Secondly, the main character, sort of who we follow, is a man, whereas in all the other works, we follow women. We don't follow the man. And the idea of the mécanique or the mechanic comes from that sort of routine, from the routine of the man who sort of falls in love with his neighbor who's a bit older than he is. Then she goes away. So it's that sort of the breaking of the routine through the weight. And a lot of the mechanical is also the language, right? So we start seeing these sort of innovations in language use that I'm going to talk to you about on the other 4 works, but we start seeing them, the sort of the repetition, the alliterations, the way that the novel is phrased. So there's, I think, a lot of work to be done on La Mécanique, but as I said, she didn't publish it in her lifetime, despite the fact that she did send it to America. So when she was in Paris, she sort of put it in an envelope. That's why you've got the envelope there. She kind of put the manuscript and she has sent it to her because she was living in the States. So she did send it to herself to have. I guess it's also important in the context of 1968 to know that she had translated Herbert Marcuse's The Unidimensional Men in 1968. So that's still at the same time as May 68, and that is still published by Éditions de Minuit. So there's a lot of work that she's done, not just writerly, but also translation work and then philosophical and activist work. But kind of the 4 works that I want to cover today. Now, when I say cover, it really is doing a lot of heavy lifting here because I'm only scratching the surface. But there are these 4 ones that sort of she's very well known for, and these are the ones that were published with Éditions de Minuit. So Opoponax, published in 1964, Les Guerrières, published in 1969, Le Corps Lesbien, 1973, and Virgile Non, 1985. All of them have been translated in English as well, some better than others. Now, one thing that's important to sort of know about Wittig, and really that's kind of where the rest of my talk is sort of picking up from, Wittig believed that language has an effect on reality. Wittig believed that language has an impact on reality. So that language doesn't just represent reality. You know, we write or we speak and we say what's in the world. It's not just a representational tool, but actually that language creates reality. There is a plasticity of language in reality. Language can have an impact. It leaves a mark on the world. Words have an impact on the world. They have weight and they will leave a mark on the world or an impact. So it's a distinction between language as a representational tool. So we use language to represent reality, and actually language creating reality itself. What that means is that also language will then create power relations. If language has the power to create reality, it will create hierarchies, it will create power relations. It also means that through language, we can challenge some of these power relations and some of these hierarchies. But it really is important to remember this, because language, through this power of creating reality, it will also create speaking positions. So the position from which one speaks. And that's really what Wittig is also looking for. These works are a search for the speaking position. All of her narrators or characters are trying to find the speaking position that fits for them. And that's why, because language creates reality, Wittig is focusing on some grammatical constructions, especially the pronoun, to kind of show that some of these pronouns are not neutral, to show that even if we think that they're actually biased, and that behind them they hide power relations and power structures, or that if we have certain pronouns that we assume speak for everybody, that actually that they don't, that a lot of people and a lot of marginalized groups are excluded from these pronouns. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about today as well. And then for each of the novels, this is another thing, only 2 of them are called novels. So you'll see I've highlighted in yellow. So the Opoponax has roman, so novel, the first one, and the last one, Virgile Non, also has novel. The other 2 do not have any indication of what they are as a genre. Now, all of them are also a sort of reinterpretation of a genre that we're very familiar with. We can consider it a reinterpretation. At times we can consider it a parody, for example. So it really is a mix of the 2, a rewriting or a parody of known genres. So Le Opoponax is a rewriting of a Bildungsroman, so a novel of becoming, a novel of sort of how, in this case, a child then kind of grows up and becomes a teenager and also finds a speaking position and becomes or starts to experience writing. Les Guerrières is a rewriting of the epic poem. So if we're thinking here about the Iliad, for example. Le Corps Lesbien is a sort of lesbian song of songs. So it's a sort of rewriting of a biblical text. And Virgile Non is a rewriting of a katabatic journey. So a journey to hell, a descent to the underworld. So thinking here of Dante's Divine Comedy, for example. These are sort of the main 4 genres that are being rewritten, but within each of the works, there's other genres that are being rewritten or parodied. So this is really a kind of a very sort of surface general overview. And for each of them, I've sort of given you the pronoun that I'm going to talk about, or the pronoun that she kind of explores or challenges. And then at the bottom, some of the sort of topics that I want to focus on. So for Opoponax, the idea of reading and writing. For Guerrière and Le Corps Lesbien, typography and mythology. And for Virgile Non, I'll actually show you some of the archival discoveries. It's important to know that Monique Wittig leaves France in 1976 in a sort of exile to the United States. And then she starts teaching there at different universities, writing a lot of her sort of philosophical writings, and Virgile Non, so she writes fiction as well. So, and that's where she lives from 1976 until her passing in 2003. She obviously does come back to France, but not to live. And her archives are held at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which is a specialist library at the University of Yale. So they were, her partner Sandy Zeiger gave them to the Beinecke, and that's where we can find them, and they're open to research. And I was lucky enough to go last year and actually have a look, and they're absolutely wonderful. So I thought I'll share some discoveries from there on the last novel. Right, so this is the first one, L'Opoponax, which is published in 1964. So that's my only pre-68 kind of novel. And we can call this one a novel because it says on the cover. And in this one, she uses the pronoun on, O-N. Now, in English, we would probably translate that as they. In French, it's a gender-neutral pronoun, so it doesn't have a gender. When we conjugate it in the third person singular, so just like he or she, or and it, but it kind of, it refers to they or us. It's sort of, I would say about us here, on a discuté sur Monique Wittig. So we've sort of chatted about it. It's used in the context of the Opoponax, is used to sort of to refer to the children. So it's a group of kids that is sort of defined by on. And so it's gender neutral, and it's used kind of pre-gender differentiation. So the kids haven't yet figured out that they, what gender they are, that they have what gender is, that they're different genders. So it really is this kind of pre-gender pronoun. Now, it's also quite familiar in sort of children's speak, right? Kids, when they speak, they might use on, they might not necessarily use nous, vous, il, elle. And when I tell my students, I tend to tell them don't use on, because on is informal, on is oral. So when I mark, I tend to tell them don't use on in academic writing. And that's what I was taught as well in French grammar lessons. Try to avoid using on because it's informal. And that is huge to see this in a novel, right, published with Éditions de Minuit, to see on, which we consider to be informal, we consider to be oral, we see it being used in a piece of literature. So it carries all of this sort of pre-gender, it represents the kids, and it really sets on the scene something that's considered to be a mistake, right? I mark my students off if they use it. So, I count it as a mistake in writing, and yet here it's used all the time. And again, it's used to sort of give that sense of the kids. Now, this novel, when it comes out in 1964, it actually won Le Prix Médicis. Now, Le Prix Médicis is one of the most famous and most well-regarded literary prizes in France. Monique Wittig is 29 when she wins this prize, so she's really young. And a lot of the reviews at the time kind of pick up on the fact that she's young, that sort of she wrote this novel in 6 months. So they really sort of building her up to this kind of lonely genius, if you will. We see that very often with male writers. So they're building her up, but they are picking on sort of her physical appearance. So quite a lot of the articles as well sort of mention how she looks, what she was wearing, etc. So I've done quite a lot of work on the reviews and that kind of image that they create. But generally, it was incredibly well received, at least in the Francophone world or in the French, on the French literary scene. In the English one, so here in England, if you look at the reviews, they're sort of mixed, but partly because obviously there's the sort of translation, and the translation doesn't quite sort of transpose the on and that work on the pronoun and that sort of child speak that we see in the novel. So there's that as well. But just to give you a sense of some of the reviews. So Claude Simon, I see, I breathe, I chew, I feel through her eyes, her mouth, her hands, her skin. I am no longer myself, neither am I a particular girl any longer. I become childhood. Marguerite Duras, so she writes this fantastic review that actually is at the back, is the postface of Le Poponax. Fantastic review, and for a long time, all of the reviews kind of say, no, she was hailed by Marguerite Duras, almost certainly the first modern book written on childhood. So it's this idea that we're not reading an adult writing a book about kids, but actually we're so close to how the kids speak, to how they behave, to the way that they think, to the way that their attention jumps from one thing to the other, to the fact that on the par with, you know, the death of a family member, they have their holidays or their kids play. So there's really sort of no differentiation between what happens. They have no sense of time. And so all of this is so close on the page, is so close to the reader, that we're almost thinking that we're reading what the kids are saying and doing, rather than we tend to forget that it's an adult who has written about the kids. So it's really, we're sort of managing to cross that sort of step, and we're very close to the kids. So what I want to focus on in the sort of the kind of the next few minutes on the Opoponax, there's plenty to say about it, and plenty to say about the reviews as well. But as we go through the book, we start with a group of kids, and as we go through it, we become more and more individual. So we end up, our focus narrows down, and from the group, we end up to one person or two people. And that person is Catherine Legrand. So she sort of becomes the girl that we follow. And at the end of the novel, the on is replaced by the je, so by the I, but that only really happens at the very end. So only at the very end, she finds a speaking position. She's capable of asserting herself as a je. And also at the very end, and this assertion of the speaking position is possible because she finds teenage love. But unlike sort of your more traditional teenage love, this is teenage love for another girl in her class, for Valérie Borges. So it's very much this, in the second half, we see sort of this blossoming love from Catherine Legrand towards Valérie Borges. But she finds this speaking position, and she starts finding also a writerly position, right? She starts reading, she starts understanding, okay, what is it that we're reading? How is knowledge passed on? So we do see a sort of almost a Bildungsroman, not just of teenage love between two girls, but also the Bildungsroman of somebody who might become a writer later on, or at least a very, very avid reader. And at the very end of the novel, there's this wonderful realization of how knowledge is passed on. It's kind of said in passing, right? As sort of kids say, everything we know about Ulysses' characters, the Trojan War, the adventures and the returns, comes from people who tell their stories while sitting down at the table of their hosts. So really, one of the foundational texts of European civilization, the Odyssey, is basically a bunch of stories of people sitting down at a table and telling their stories. So in this sort of phrase that's kind of thrown out there is the realization that what we claim as knowledge and what has really been one of the foundational stories about civilization is just a bunch of people talking. And it starts asking the questions, who do we believe? What stories are being told? What stories are not being told? How do we know that the story that they're telling is true? So it's really starting to question that sort of passing on of knowledge. Now, at the very start of the text, we see her sort of reading, and Catherine Legrand is somebody who enjoys reading, but she's also aware that what she's reading isn't quite free or isn't quite free choice. So and again, when I say she, it's very much on. It's still that on, which I've sort of translated as the we, but it doesn't quite capture that because it's sort of on us as a group, right? When we're older, we will be able to read without the ruler and without our sister. This is because they're in a Catholic school. All on our own from a book without repeating. We will read heaps of pages without stopping. So that idea of wanting to read more, of having that appetite for reading. But what I really like in the French, so they say lire sans la règle. Now, la règle can mean the ruler, so the rule that you use to draw lines, but it can also mean the rule. So reading without rules, reading without being sort of guided, having that true freedom to select what you read. You don't have to read it out loud. You don't have to read it with the others. You don't necessarily have to repeat it. So there is early on a sense that actually what is being passed on as knowledge is really only half of the story. And there's lots of other things that could be said. At this more or less at the same time, so about 20 pages later, there is also this realization. Miss says that ink is poison. So this is when it happens, when sort of Catherine Legrand moves from writing in a pencil to writing in ink. So again, that marks quite an important point in childhood. Now, we can take this at face value. You know, they used to have ink, and yeah, they shouldn't drink it. It is poison. So we can take it at sort of that sort of naive kids talk. You shouldn't drink that. It's poison. But there's obviously that other double meaning, that ink is poison. We know what writing can do, right? We know the power that writing can have. But we as people who are reading it, we're aware of this double meaning. We're not entirely sure if the kids are aware of it. We know that for sure that the writer, the narrator is, the adult writer is, but we're kind of caught in this limbo, which is quite a destabilizing position, because we're sort of in between these two meanings, the literal meaning and the kind of metaphorical meaning. And this idea of destabilization is really where Wittig wants you to be. She keeps you in that kind of destabilizing place throughout the works. I'm just mindful of the time. So what I might do is I might skip a bit through, because I don't, you know, as interesting as I find this, I'm not sure everybody else does. So I might skip through the next novels, and then if we've got time in the Q&A, I might come back to some of the reading in Lopoponax. But this is the second one. It's called Les Guerrières, published in 1969, so after May 68 and after the translation of Marcuse's The Unidimensional Men. Now, the word guerrière doesn't exist in French. It's a neologism. It's a word that Wittig invented. The same for opoponax. Opopanax exists, and it's a resin. It's just sort of a substance that's secreted by flowers. But opoponax, it's a neologism that she invents. Guerrière, the same, but guerrière, at least you can sort of think, okay, guerre, guerrier, so warrior. You can also think about the guerrilla. So there is something to sort of to link it to. And in this novel, so the pronoun that's kind of very much present is elle. Now you will see on the cover, this is the cover of the new edition that Minuit published. So the pronoun that dominates, so if in Lopoponax the pronoun that dominated was on, in Les Guerrières the pronoun that dominates the text is elle. Now the reason for that is that generally in French, if we use il, which is the masculine plural, it's kind of assumed that it's not just men, that it covers everybody. But to give you an example, and this is something that Marie Dariussec likes to quote a lot, if in a room you've got 1 million women and a dog, you have to refer to them as il, if the dog is sort of a male dog. So that's il in French. Yes, it's neutral. Yes, it's meant to refer to everybody, but actually it's very much biased. And that's what Wittig is trying to show us, that we use this pronoun, but it has an impact. It creates a reality, right? It has that sort of that plasticity of language on the real. It has an impact. It's not unbiased. It's not neutral. And she's showing us this by completely replacing it with elle. Okay, this is our new universalizing pronoun, right? Everybody here is a female warrior, a guerrière, an elle. Now, in English, when they translated this in English, they translated it as sometimes they, sometimes the women, and it doesn't quite do the same thing. First of all, it's a noun, not a pronoun, and it really, that all of that universalizing intent that Wittig wanted to show is kind of lost when we use the women. But she didn't just want to sort of change, oh, we're just going to replace men with women. She really wanted to show that we're using some words without necessarily thinking of what reality they're creating, and that's why she was sort of replacing it with elle. Now, it's not just the pronouns in Les Guerrières. We do have sort of typographical innovations. So we see this circle, and again, many, many meanings in the text, but put simply, it separates the 3 sections of the book. And I can't call it a novel because it doesn't say novel on the cover. And what's important is that actually the order in which you read it, so if you follow the order of the pages, it's not actually the order of the action. So the last section in Les Guerrières is actually the one that happens chronologically the first. So there is a war, there's a conflict between il and elle, so between they feminine and they masculine, and elle win this conflict. But if that would have been the first section in the book, so if it would have followed chronologically, that destabilizing effect of us reading elle constantly would have been lost, because we would have had to read elle and il because they were fighting. So actually, as you read the novel, the first bit that you read is chronologically the second part that you read is chronologically the third part, so the finality of the sort of the conflict and what happens after the conflict, and the last part that you read is actually the first one. So again, you're not just destabilized by pronouns, you're destabilized by the order you're supposed to read this, because you start it and then you realize, oh, okay, what am I doing? How is this working? Then on top of that, you're destabilized by this, because you're meant to, what do I do with the circle? Do I read it? Do I write on it? What am I supposed to do? Is it just something nice to separate the sort of the three sections? It isn't just something nice, because then the circle is referenced in the text itself. So it's a way of understanding the text. It's a way in which les guerrières themselves make sense of the world and of this sort of specificities. So there's many, many meanings that are sort of given to the circles. But again, I'm sort of jumping through because I want to get to one of my favorite bits in the book. And every now and again, we have these pages that just have names on them. Now, these are all women's names. We can tell some of them are adapted. So you have Oedipa, which is the sort of the feminine, would be the feminine of Oedipus. So some of them are sort of created. Some of them are actual names that exist. So they could be saints, it could be historical figures, it could be mythological figures, but they cover a huge array of geographical diversity, a huge array of historical diversity. So if you were to spend time researching every single character, we'd probably be here until sort of, I don't know, Christmas time. So, but it's your choice. You as a reader, you can read them, you can skip them, because they're not necessary. You don't necessarily think, oh, how do they affect the narrative? Or you kind of get the sense that they are the guerrières, that they are these warriors. Some reviewers have seen them as tombs. So some have read them as the tombs of the warriors. We can also read them in that sort of in that tradition of the epic poem. So in the Iliad, Homer kind of lists all the warriors, so we can read it like that as well. So really is a readerly choice. But what I also want to highlight, and it's something that Wittig's niece highlighted to me, is that, this is quite as a typographical choice, it's not normal. You don't see books with circles in them or with sort of, capital letters and just sort of names written in them. And in the next one, it's even more in Le Corps Lesbien. So this had to be negotiated, right? Typographically speaking, it's not straightforward. I just send in my manuscript and they print it. This really had to be negotiated. So it had to be a discussion between Wittig, between Jérôme Landon and the typists who were sort of putting this together. I want to show you my favorite section, and I will dwell on this a bit, and then I'll sort of see if we want to go to questions or listen to the rest of it. But this is probably my favorite part from Les Guerrières. I do have the English translation as well. And for this one, I've selected the published English translation. So it's a section. Very often in Les Guerrières, we see the guerrière, so elle, listening to stories or reading stories. Very often we sort of get the sense that they're actually reading the book we're reading, or that they're reading something very similar to it. But they also listen to stories from other guerrières around them. And this time is Sophie Ménade's turn to tell a story. And she tells the story of this orchard planted with trees of every color. A naked woman walks therein. Her beautiful body is black and shining. Her hair consists of slender mobile snakes, which produce music at her every movement. This is the hortative head of hair. It is so called because it communicates by the mouth of its 100,000 snakes with the woman wearing the headdress. Orpheus, the favorite snake of the woman who walks in the garden, keeps advising her to eat the fruit of the tree in the center of the garden. The woman tastes the fruit of each tree, asking Orpheus, the snake, how to recognize that which is good. The answer given is that it sparkles, that merely to look at it rejoices the heart. Or else the answer is given that as soon as she has eaten the fruit, she will become taller, she will grow, her feet will not leave the ground, though her forehead will touch the stars. Just want to, there we go. She will acquire knowledge. I just wanted to skip it. So we get the sense that it's a lot of foundational stories put together, right? We recognize the Garden of Eden, we recognize the story of the fall, but here there is no fall. We also recognize the story of Medusa, right, with her head of snake. So it's really a syncretism. It's a combination of different tradition, Greco-Roman myth and biblical stories, but they're very different. So these foundational stories are being rewritten to show us whose voice we haven't heard and whom we haven't seen yet. So it's completely, we have the same Garden of Eden, so this sort of orchard planted with trees of in every color, but we only see one body. We only see Eve Medusa. I'm going to call her the Eve Medusa figure. She is not accompanied by Adam. Nobody's looking upon her body. She walks naked, beautiful body, is black and shining. So it's very, very different to what we're used to in sort of depictions here. And it's very different from what we used to in depictions of Eve. In art, she tends to be depicted as white. And it's also very different from depictions of Medusa. Now, Medusa was an Ethiopian princess, but in Caravaggio's painting, you wouldn't be able to tell. So the depiction that Wittig gives, the Eve Medusa figure, is actually closer to both what we would call sort of mitochondrial Eve, so the sort of the mother of all humanity, which originates from somewhere in Ethiopia, and actually also closer to what Medusa would have looked like as an Ethiopian princess. So we have that sort of accuracy. She's walking alone, she's walking naked, nobody's bothering her, there's no eyes on her, there's no male gaze. She is really very much enjoying this space. Now, Orpheus, the writer, the creator, the musician, is recast as one of the snakes. Now, if you're familiar with the Medusa myth, there's no fear here. There's no fear of petrification. She's not going to turn you to stone. You can look at her. There's no indication that there's any danger here that she will turn you into stone. There's also no indication of the fear of castration that Freud associated with the snakes and with Medusa. So it's a complete rewriting, a much more joyous and sort of, it's complete rewriting of these stories. But what we're interested in is that if she eats the apple, nothing bad will happen. What happens if she eats the apple? She will just have knowledge. And that is something that has often been refused for women, knowledge, access to language. And if you look at what happens if she eats it, is that she will grow, and she will grow to such a level, she grows to sort of cosmic proportions, right? Her forehead will reach the stars. So she's still we still have this focus on her body. She will grow in height, but she will have this kind of cosmic higher knowledge. Now, if you look at who tells the story is told by Sophie Menad. Now, Sophie comes from Sophia, which means wisdom in Greek. The Menads were these basically followers of Bacchus, kind of like the Bacchanti. So really enjoying life, enjoying the pleasures of life, food, drink, dancing, taking pleasure in their bodies. So what this story is telling us is that knowledge doesn't just come from the rational, from the mind, but actually that knowledge comes from the body as well. And it's that acknowledgement that knowledge is produced, not in just sort of Cartesian dual way, just in the mind, but actually that there is knowledge that's produced by the body, and it is just as valuable. And that is just said in that little sort of mentioning of the name Sophie Menad, both wisdom and the body. And we see this sort of rewriting of the foundational stories. And I'll go back to these names here, because it's also those names that have been forgotten from history, have been forgotten from foundational stories. So what Wittig is doing is she's giving them the page. She's giving them a book where they have that eternity and where they can tell their stories, and they can tell their stories together. Now, I'm very, very conscious of the time, so I think that I'm going to end on that optimistic note, and I'll leave the second half for, well, it's not half left, but I'll leave that for any questions, because I think that maybe we want to chat amongst ourselves. So thank you very, very much, and I hope you enjoyed that. Yeah, definitely over-prepared. Classic me. It happens in my lectures as well.
Oh, it's lovely to see your excitement and enthusiasm and the way you're
my favorite section.
Translating it for us. So the conveners of this group are Ian Gadd, who's sitting in the back, And hopefully those of you online, if you have any questions, then Ian will pick them up. And I will try to do the same with the room. So does anybody in the room have a question for our speaker? Well, I have three, but please interrupt me if anybody else comes up with something. So I have to admit I did a little research because I didn't know a lot about this person, but it seems like we should know a lot about this person. And I'm currently reading The Group by Mary McCarthy, and she was an early supporter. So I was wondering if you might mention something about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I assume that they met in Paris, and this is all coming from the archive. So kind of from the letters or the notes that I was able to sort of gather from the archive. So Mary McCarthy was an early supporter of Monique Wittig, and she has written about the Opoponax. So she really enjoyed, and she wrote kind of a critical chapter about the Opoponax, again, really saying that it's the book, a modern book about childhood. And she organized for Monique Wittig kind of like a party for when the books were published at her house. So really she was sort of almost like organizing a literary circle around Wittig and inviting journalists, publishers, and people who would enjoy knowing her. She was quite, Wittig was very young at this point. I'm not sure how much she knew of sort of the Parisian literary world. She did have contacts through her work in the publishing house, and she knew journalists as well. But really, Mary McCarthy was a big early supporter of Monique Wittig's. And I think, if I remember correctly, but this I might have to check in the letters, that she then helps her when she goes to the States. She puts her in contact with different academics so that she can go and teach different units, different courses in the States. So it's really an important figure. And I think there are colleagues of mine at Yale and Harvard who are currently working on sort of writing articles about the relationship between Mary McCarthy and Monique Wittig. So I think that's work in progress.
Anybody else come up with one? Ian, do you have one? The mic, okay.
This on? Yes, brilliant. So couple of comments. Well, comment and a question. I'll do the comment first because it's to thank you for an interesting, inspiring talk, or infectious enthusiasm. So this is Michael Biggs from the University of Hertfordshire saying he wants to read more of and by Wittig. The question, which comes from C.A. Grenville, is who also says very interesting exposition. What about Wittig's philosophical views and Beauvoir's influence, both positive or negative, on her writings?
That's a very, very good question. And as I said, I was really scratching the surface with Wittig, and really my focus was mainly on fiction, but there's a lot of philosophical work that we can dwell on, and we can't really look at the fiction without looking at the philosophical work. And I did want to mention Simone de Beauvoir. So Simone de Beauvoir publishes The Second Sex in 1949. Now, by the time that the MLF sort of starts, we're kind of about 20 years later. Surprisingly, a lot of the young activists, so the MLF, there's different ages in the MLF, but a lot of the young activists say that, we had to discover Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, right? So it wasn't necessary. Now we take it for granted, we teach it, we mention it all the time, but it wasn't necessarily something that was being taught even at university. So they kind of had to read it and to go and discover it by themselves. So that's on the sort of the activist side. Now, when they create, so Monique Wittig was part of the group that created Question Feminist, or Feminist Issues. So it was a journal of articles and sort of exploring Question Feminist, feminist issues. Again, a few years after that, there's a big schism in Question Feminist. But Simone de Beauvoir was invited to sort of be kind of like a godmother of the publication, so really supporting the publication of Question Feminist. Now, if we look at Simone de Beauvoir's figure during the MLF, she was probably, she was a bit older than some of the activists. So she had, by this point, published, and so she was working on her writings, but she was very, very supportive. And she sort of goes in the direction of putting together the association Choisir. So that was for helping with the legalization of abortion in France and helping any of the women and their families who were accused of abortion before it became legal. So there was a sort of trials, and she worked very closely with Gisèle Halimi, who passed away not long ago, who's a famous French lawyer, and they were working really towards the legalization of abortion. So we have that sort of part of involvement of Simone de Beauvoir, almost as a sort of godmother on the side of activism, but also on the side of publication and Question Feminist. And then we have the young activists who are sort of rediscovering Le Deuxième Sexe that was published in 1949. The Wittig's philosophical writing, and it's the sort of the book that we recommend, we recommend students, it's called La Pensée Straight, or The Straight Mind. And it actually gets published first in English in 1992 with Beacon Press. And then almost 10 years later, in 2001, it gets published in French with Édition Ballon. So it's quite a big sort of gap. But it's a collection of articles that Wittig has written from the 17 onwards about the point of view, about the use of pronouns, about sort of language, the impact that language has on reality. And in one of them, it's that sort of famous line that she is known for: lesbians are not women. And that's really, all of the sort of, a lot of the feminist writers that I've mentioned are probably known for wanting one thing, which is very reductive, because they have a huge body of work. But if there's one sentence that she's known for, it's that idea that lesbians are not women. And that is sort of in direct quotation marks. What she means by that is that lesbians are not part of the sort of the heterosexual economic system, or the heterosexual patriarchy, so that they don't relate in the relationship woman to woman. They don't relate in the same way in sort of that power structure as women to men do, if we think about household tasks, if we think about work. So that's kind of what she's trying to say, not that they're not women, but obviously this sentence was taken, used and abused and misused and misinterpreted, but that's probably one that she's really, really famous for, and that is written in one of the essays in La Pensée Straight. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it's a very, very long answer.
I have a question, which is a very Anglophone question. You did touch on this in terms of the translations. And I confess, embarrassed, I did not know of her. Kristeva Sisu and Igre, I know. Where should somebody who's reading in English start? Is there a really good translation of one of the novels, or where would you recommend somebody starting?
Excellent question. Probably with the first one, the Opoponax. If you want to start with something shorter, I would start with the short stories, and one of them, Le Jardin, or The Garden, has been translated by one of her students, and that's sort of available on Project Muse. So it's a translation that her student had worked with Wittig on it. So I think that's probably more kind of accessible from that point of view. But probably with the Opoponax, just to really get that, because then in English, a lot of the work that she's doing on pronoun gets sort of distorted. My favorite novel is Virgile No, and that's the last one. It's translated as Across the Acheron, but I actually will go through just because it's really interesting. When they talk about the translation, it's the translation, and she likes this translator, David LaVey. She says that, I like his work. I like the way that he works on my novels, on my books. But so Peter Owen's commissioned David LaVey to translate Across the Acheron, and the translation is not really good. They have to bring in Margaret Crossland to review the translation. Now, when they ask the American publishers, will you publish it? Will you commission another translation? They say, look, we've looked at the translation that Peter Owen's commissioned, and it is bad. We don't, it's not good enough. So we don't know if they're going to distribute it in the US or not. So it is, there are a lot of sort of challenges in translation. Virgile No is probably one that, if somebody wanted to translate it, it's probably, the interest, there's not as much work on pronouns there. So I think it's more accessible to be translated in English than, say, Le Corps Lesbien or Les Guerrières. But in the archives, there's an entire manuscript of Les Guerrières that's already translated, and it's got post-it notes by Wittig. It's like, why is this like this? This needs to change. And then answers from her translator. So it's a long work. And there's a heartbreaking letter in the archives in which Wittig says, you don't know what it feels like not to recognize your texts in translation. So to think that they are not the ones that you have written. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done there. And as far as I know, Annabelle Kim from Harvard is working on a translation of Le Chantier Littéraire. Le Chantier Littéraire is kind of a theoretical work by Wittig that's inspired from her doctoral thesis. And that's a really difficult one to translate. And I think that that's coming out with Verso, if I'm not mistaken. So it will be really good to have that as a sort of as a tool to understand more of what Wittig is doing, and especially for Anglophone audiences.
So she could understand English, but she didn't write in it.
She did. She understood. She spoke. She taught in English. So that's her syllabus. She also taught on her own works. So she taught in English, and some of her essays, some of the theoretical essays, she wrote in English, but a lot of them she wrote in French, and they got translated in English. But the fiction she wrote in French, so not in English. And she also did talks at the MLA in English, so she was fluent in English.
Has anybody else thought of a question since we started? Otherwise, in thinking about this talk tonight, I started looking out for her name, and you do see it. And I think what you've done is given us a sort of an understanding of where she is important, what she's done, and hopefully we will grow in our knowledge of her as well. So thank you very much.